Good morning and welcome to Morning Moments. I am so glad that you took the time to join us this morning. Today, I have an author, a podcast host. He is and other things. Mike Tourville from Massachusetts. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you, Andy. Appreciate you having me on. Thank you.
You sent me your wonderful book, and when I looked at a lot of folks that was involved in the book and the film, I've interviewed on Morning Moments, and we have a lot of great connections with folks. Welcome to Morning Moments. Tell us, what do you do and why do you do it?
Well, like you said, a lot of things aside from being an author and a podcast host. And I'll tell you quickly, I'm a marketing and sales director for a company called Evans Cooling Systems. We make a waterless engine coolant for cars. It's a great product, and for car collectors and museums. Why I do that is to support my family. So that's why I do that. But that's not why you have me here today. It's not about the coolant. It's not the most exciting topic. What I do is I love to write. I love to tell stories, and I loved having conversations. So with all those things that I like to do, I've written a couple of books. The first, which you mentioned, is called A Promise to Astrid, which is a wonderful story.
Here it is right here, folks. If you see it right there. Great book.
Yeah. And with JC Films, it was made into a film in 2018. And we had a great experience. And this is why we have some mutual friends through JC Films and Joanne Peterson and many others involved with that movie, A Promise to Astrid. It's a very touching movie, and it stuck with me. It occurred in 1987. It took me 25 years to write it, and when I talk about it I still get choked up, I still get emotional, and I still cry 35 years later after the event. That's how impactful it was. And the second book is called Voices from the Fallen. This is a book about addiction, a very different topic, but it's shared stories of addiction, grief, recovery, and courage. It's called Voices from the Fallen. And that was an experience, writing that book, because we interviewed many people going through addiction and recovery, and meeting with people across the kitchen table, sharing their most intimate stories, tragic stories in some cases. And I think that was worth sharing to help people heal from addiction in the family. And then from there, after interviewing many people about the book, sorry about that, I shut off one phone and the other phone goes off. Sorry. People want their story shared, so we started a podcast called Healing Voices Project, where we share stories and help families heal. It's called Healing Voices Project Podcast. And to why I do that? Well, because I found the passion in helping people and what impact it can have. As I said earlier, I do my full-time job for income. I don't do the podcast or books for income. This is just a passion. And I find it so fulfilling, and to leave some impact on someone's lives, to know that maybe one person's life has changed as a result of this, means everything.
Your first book talked about somewhat of an angel that lived next door to you.
Yes.
And how, and I don't want to ruin the story because I want people to get the book and also watch the film. It's on PureFlix, by the way, and other places. This lady that you come in contact with just was a giver and just made an impact on your life for years to come.
Yes. And I think I told you earlier, I still get emotional when I talk about it 35 years after, and it's just crazy. But she, at the time, and I was 27 at the time, and she was 80. Now, 80 seemed really old when I was 27. It's not so old now. And she drove a rusty old Volkswagen, and she offered to help us. We were going through some rough times, and I dismissed her. I said, "Oh, she's a little crazy. She's eccentric. She's 80 years old and just tends to her garden. How can she help?" Well, little did I know the impact it would have, not then, but for the rest of our lives. So I I resisted her help for a while. And I come to think that she was an angel sent from God because of the series of events that happened. And then even after her death, how things transpired that just kept reminding me that there was more to this than just an 80-year-old neighbor. There was more to this, more behind this. There was more things at work than I knew of at the time.
You know, our actions that we take, the actions of addiction, the actions of what addictions do to family members for years later.
Mm-hmm.
And as a psychiatric nurse, I have seen the impact of addiction on families and individuals. Our actions make a difference, just like the actions of kindness. When you, what do you want to be remembered for years from now? Do you want to be remembered for being the person who had the act of kindness, or the person that had the act of addiction that affected their lives? We have a choice of how we're going to leave this world and what we're going to leave our heritage to the next generation.
There's a lot there, and it certainly becomes more important as we get older.
Yes.
And more reflective about things like this. Is partly why I wanted to share the story of Astrid. And I've heard from so many people how Astrid affected their lives 30 years after her death. And with addiction too, again, I didn't know a lot about addiction. We did the Jack Jonah movie. A friend of mine's son died at 19 years old, died of a heroin overdose. And so we were just trying to support the movie that we did called Jack Jonah about addiction. And after talking to people about that, I was interviewing people. I said, these stories have to be told. These stories just have to be told. And all the people I've interviewed said, I went through hell. Our families went through such turmoil, but by sharing our stories, if it can help one person.
Yeah.
So these stories are very personal. They're not like case studies at all. And the point is, each of them said, I will put myself out there and share all the tragedy and all the ugliness behind it. Put myself out there naked emotionally, if it'll help people. And I've already heard back from people saying, you know, boy, I read your story, and their stories are very relatable. Yeah. And they're all different. So you could be a 55-year-old grandfather who starts shooting up heroin after post-pain pill addiction. You could be a 25-year-old mom who starts using heroin after toothache. And people who have recreational use, and all different things that maybe one family can relate to and say, you know, this is us. This is who we are, what we're struggling with.
Nobody gets up in the morning and says, today I want to be an addict. They say, well, that never happens. What happens, it just follows you. And unfortunately, when our society looks at, well, they're just another addict, another alcoholic, another drug-seeking person, another whatever, and we don't see the humanity behind it. Here is a soul, a person that's desperate. Often when, and I know this as a nurse, we don't know why people started using until they're clean. You know, I've often heard clinicians say, you got to be clean for 6 months before 3 to 6 months before you even get a good diagnosis, because you don't know what the drugs or alcohol is covering up. And when you start to uncover that, you realize, wow, what a horrendous story behind it was there as well. Not always, but often. And then we think, well, there's a story and there's a person behind that. What are we doing for them, rather than saying it's another addict?
And it's with that word that we've heard a million times, stigma, and the stigma that exists, and getting past that. And again, it's like alcoholism, that's changed, where people's perceptions have changed a little bit. Okay, because we have celebrities and people from any profession, any financial status, nobody's immune to
No.
this. And so I think that starting to change, but still, people aren't talking about it that much because it's a bit shameful. People don't want to talk about it. They don't want their family tragedy and secrets out there. And I understand that. But the more that can be shared, the more people are comfortable saying, and this is what happened when I was working with the Jack Jonah movie. People said, I'm here because my brother just passed away from an overdose,
Yeah.
or my daughter is an addict and I don't know what to do. And maybe we can learn something. I was overwhelmed with how many people this has affected. So, and I think some of these people who have their stories say, I've always wanted my story told. I just didn't know where to begin. I don't know how to start. I don't have a platform to share my story. How do I do it? And that's where this evolved from the book and the podcast, giving somebody a chance to let their voice be heard.
Yeah.
That's what we're doing.
When people look at others, they go, shame on you for what you've done to your family. Shame on you. When we come to Christ, Christ says, shame off you. Shame off you. He takes the shame off of us.
Never thought of it that way.
There's no need to be shameful because of the price that he paid for us. He took our shame for us. He became shame for us, that we may have life and have that life more abundantly. And I'm so grateful for the grace of God. God loves us when we're unlovable. There's no place you've been that God says, I won't come after you. God loves you just the way you are, but he also loves us enough to not to let us stay that way.
Yeah. Well, and if you think about in some of these stories, in fact, there was another person I just interviewed on the podcast. And by the way, in the book, there's many stories that people found, Christian programs, Celebrate Recovery being one of them, that has worked very well for people. But a recent podcast guest who is a mutual friend, I think, of some of the people in the book through JC Films, and Michael Ocho Terena, he was a gang member, heroin addict, in and out of jail, a loan shark enforcer, where he did terrible things to people. And he said, I'm an evil person. Those are his words. I'm an evil person, and I don't care if I'll ever die. And any of my actions are just inconsequential. I can do whatever I want. And he did. And he paid for it dearly. But now he was saved. Now he's an evangelist. He's an actor. Travels all over the country. He's a motivational speaker. He speaks at churches, and he's a father, he's a husband, wonderful guy.
Yeah. And
how God has transformed his life completely. And in his words, he was evil, but he's saved. And he said, I can't hardly find anyone who was as evil as I was. So there's one example anyway.
Well, some of you are watching this podcast today in this Morning Moments, and you're going, I needed to hear, or I know somebody else that needs to hear this, pass this message on. I'm going to put down below how you could get a hold of Mike's books, and also his podcast and all that information, and the links connected. I want you to, look at the books. I want you to look at his podcast. I want you to look what God's using him. But more important than that, after this podcast is over, I want you to pray for Mike, that God would continue to pour his blessings, his creativity on him, and that God would continue to use him to the plan, purpose, and the hope that he has for Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you for being my guest today, Mike. And God bless you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining me for Morning Moments. And I'm going to ask you, if you would, please just keep on coming back.